And I'm like, oh, yeah, people aren't going to randomly have an axe throwing target in their backyard, so I'll do that. So I started what I called the 12-foot view. Today I talk about the field of stats mouse and the Innovation Forge vocabulary. Let's see how innovation meets artistry as we forge something extraordinary together.
You are listening to the Innovation Forge, the #1 podcast on adaptive enrollment management, exploring the data, marketing, and strategy that fuels higher education. Here's your host, David Dysart.
Welcome to a Coffee and Coals episode, our time to peek behind the curtain and learn a little more about the Innovation Forge. So grab a coffee, get comfortable, and don't forget to stoke those coals. Today I announced the winner of the Consultant Cadre naming competition, but first I wanted to talk a bit more about vocabulary, particularly the words, terms, and acronyms that show up in the Innovation Forge. They can be a bit anachronistic, so Coffee and Coals seemed like a good time to talk about them. Let's see how the field of stats mouse and our vocabulary take shape today. So I wanted to take some time today to just talk about the Innovation Forge vocabulary. As anyone who has read or listened to the Innovation Forge so far, there is definitely a motif that I have going. It's very blacksmith, very artisanal, so a lot of references to those kinds of things, the workshop, the hammers, forge, all of that. So I definitely leaned heavy into that pretty quickly. I had written the book largely before I had figured that branding out entirely. Towards the end of it, I think I was definitely like that. That's where I was going. And I think a lot of that was born out of, I had made a LinkedIn post talking about artisanal student journeys. And I was just like, oh, artisanal, that really gets to a lot of the heart of what I'm trying to do with adaptive enrollment management. And I'll talk about that in a minute. that whole framework. But that really struck me and stuck with me. And just fun, after that, I hadn't even thought about this originally, was just how it kind of blends with my name. So Dysart, artisanal. So I really definitely leaned onto that pretty strongly for the general motif. And I think that shaped a lot of how I viewed the branding of like the Innovation Forge, things like that. And honestly, the podcast piece wasn't even going to be the same. I was thinking about more so just a straight adaptive enrollment management podcast that kind of didn't have that branding behind it. I'm glad I ended up choosing to keep that branding the same. It's a lot more fun building a blacksmith motif podcast than a generic enrollment management one that doesn't have as much branding or theme to bite onto. But so I've definitely enjoyed that decision, regardless of how that affects the reach of it. But so yeah, definitely that. I think that post alone really shaped a lot of the journey of the Innovation Forge and the work that I'm doing through the book, through the podcast, on LinkedIn, stuff like that. But the adaptive enrollment management piece actually came a step back. Back when I was doing consulting, there were people who did like, oh, I'm going to make my coffee and we're going to chat about a topic in the morning. And those were always really interesting, but like everyone was doing coffee and stuff like that. So I'm like, what is something different that's just no one else in either the Slate space, Slate community, higher education community, what are they not going to be doing when talking about these kinds of topics? And I had actually built an axe throwing range in my backyard, at least a couple of years before this. And I'm like, oh, yeah, people aren't going to randomly have an axe throwing target in their backyard, so I'll do that. So I started what I called the 12-foot view, kind of just taking something that wasn't the 10-foot view or wasn't the 10,000-foot view, but something in between, where it wasn't this really grand, spectrum-y perspective of the landscape, 10,000-mile view of like understanding where things are going, heading, but I didn't want the really super nitty gritty, boring, okay, I'm going to build an export, I'm going to build a filter. So in axe throwing, you're typically 12 feet away from the range. So I like that as just being kind of a quirky little element of both the axe throwing, but also positioning the work and the conversations I was having in those videos somewhere in between those two distances as well. And it was around the same time that I started developing the adaptive enrollment management framework. Just because I wanted something that was different from the conversations that were, or the terminology that was happening, but also still the same. So taking that enrollment management framework, and I mean, I think typically, enrollment management is the field, but I think with the strategic enrollment management, there was so much conversation happening around that. And my piece was definitely different. It built on it, and it merged it with other pieces and focused the priority on other pieces. So I knew I wanted something with blank enrollment management to have the conversations around, but I wasn't too sure what it would be. And just silly branding consistency, if I did adaptive, it not only fits very much so with that artisanal student journey that I was already kind of working towards as a general concept. I don't think I had stumbled upon artisanal yet as kind of a thematic element, but it was definitely adaptive in the sense that we were using data in this really intense and focused way to craft a more personalized, tailored student journey, email communications, texting, like that. I mean, again, nothing that is necessarily like this revolutionary, like, oh my gosh, we could tailor communications to our student based on the data. I mean, lots of people are having those conversations in the space, but I needed a framework to have the conversation in. So the fact that AEM just sounds like aim, and I was doing the axe throwing videos, aiming the throws. So it definitely needed that synergy in my mind of like, oh, okay, we're keeping a consistent through point of the journey, kind of on a branding wise, because always got to be thinking about branding, always be branding. So that's kind of where the aim piece came from, was really rooted, I think, in what the work is, but also getting that synergy with the 12-foot view. Definitely helped forge a kind of single point for me to base it off of. So that's where the adaptive enrollment management piece comes. And I also came up while writing the book, just tons of acronyms. Because I was having an issue of like, oh, okay, these chapters kind of talk about these points, and these chapters kind of talk about these points. And I was having a hard time keeping it straight in my head. So I couldn't imagine what someone who was just trying to read through 10 chapters of a book and how to kind of apply the engagement scoring and the predictive modeling in the artisanal student journeys and the strategic enrollment management, trying to piece these into these kind of vague, like, oh, okay, this is like informative, this is tailoring, this is experiential. Like, it was nonsense. It was mush. It was a miasma of just nonsense. So I definitely leaned really heavily into the acronym piece, not only to make it easier for me to write and mentally build, but also just, again, that user experience piece of I don't have to read half a book that vaguely discusses how to use these concepts. I have these pillars of projects through the acronyms, and it's easier to remember because it's an acronym, and I am learning about this framework now. So, and I'll go through these briefly. So we have like target projections, which is that tuition aid and recruitment goals estimation tool. Really that data informed behind the scenes piece that institutions can use. Very similar kind of builds towards the crafting. So that's the customized recruitment action using forecasting and targeting. So those two really build upon each other. Like target is kind of the giant that craft stands on top of. And then nudge, which is that nurturing user decisions and guided engagement, which is getting into a lot of the prescriptive modeling. So you've built your predictive modeling and your scores. You kind of know what levers to push, to get them through that journey. So nudge is that entire prescriptive model framework to build towards. And then beacon data mining is the behavioral ecospherical analytics for conversion optimization and navigation. Basically just the fancy word saying we're going to dig up a lot of data so we can better communicate and understand our students. And ecospherical probably is another word that I don't think is used terribly often. So I'm really kind of trying to position that as well as an element in recruitment and enrollment. And it's really just that contextual piece that the student is growing up in, whether it's like their neighborhoods that you're measuring through things like the American Community Survey, census data, segment analysis, like the vendor data, market view, stuff like that. So even if you don't know specifically what a student's interested in, or they haven't explicitly told you those things, you can kind of get a sense, at least in those early stages, okay, a large portion of the students in this neighborhood are going on to grad school, and they're not applying for financial aid, but they do want to go out of state for college. You can start crafting that artisanal journey even before they've told you what they're interested in. And then so GPS is that resource allocation. It's a guided prioritization strategy. So that's, again, we're using the scores in the predictive modeling to actually start prioritizing, whether it's institutional actions, print, outreach, stuff like that, to the folks that you're going to be able to make the biggest impact for. And I just love that I'm getting more more into the weeds of these frameworks as I go. And then Scout, so that's the strategic community outreach and university travel. So that's just being more mindful and targeted with how you're recruiting students, where you're spending your money at for recruitment travel. I think one of the funnest things that have come to fruition after I wrote the book, because I was kind of getting to the point like, okay, we'll build some reports, we'll look at like kind of what are your yield rates and your application rates in this report from your different schools, to kind of start lifting to the top some maybe underutilized relationships or what you're doing with these schools that are performing really well. And then Eric Hoffpower sent me a message, and he was talking about quorum sensing, and again, getting too far into the weeds. But that definitely unlocked the quorum scoring for me, which is a huge element of this now. So if I ever do write a second edition or an updated version, that definitely has to start going into Scout. And then Thrive. Admittedly, this is probably one of the lesser developed pieces of the different frameworks, but this is the targeted human-centered resource and intervention for vital empowerment. So again, we're hitting that prescriptive modeling as we start looking at student success and empowering institutions to actually be able to deliver proactive programming to help students. With most of my work being pretty solidly in the admissions office, I have less hands-on experience with that transition to the current student and nurturing a successful student journey for them when they're on campus. But yeah, definitely that needs to be part of the conversation institutions are having when you are, whether you're implementing adaptive enrollment management or just using those principles to help your students be more successful. And then the last thing I talked about in the book in the adaptive enrollment management section was just the Enroll Mentor. And a lot of this is kind of looking out on the horizon, how AI is going to be helping with a lot of this, and the strategy piece and name buys and all of that, and just really allowing the data to be an Enroll Mentor. I like Enroll Mentor. That is one thing. I do really like the Enrollment Mentor, mash them up. I think that there is a lot there that can be mined further in future writings. It's not something I've had time to get to. So much stuff to do. But then there are just a lot of words that have kind of been created in the process of whether it's writing the book or doing the podcast, or I post on LinkedIn somewhere between 5 and 10 times a week. So there's just that a large output of writing that happens, and just kind of stumbling upon words, usually because of just the elements of the motif that I'm writing in, with the Innovation Forge and the blacksmith motif. So things like Slatewright, just as a fun term to coin for people who are very proficient and work in Slate as their primary responsibilities. And there's a lot of pieces around that as well that I started using to build to the Slate. I guess it's not really Slate. The Slate Codex is something else. The Innovation Forge Codex, which was the theme for my second semester of the podcast. The first semester I did the playing cards for the Slate team members, like the Slate Captain, Slate Wizard, stuff like that. But for semester 2, I pivoted to exploring Slate skills and staff skills and these different elements through, again, much heavier into the blacksmithing motif, medieval feel of things for the second season. So like instead of doing playing cards of my guests, I did like the kind of old-timey sketch, and then kind of like the book you'd pick up if you were a Star Trek member and you went back to medieval times and everyone could read and write. But so like off of Slatewright, there is metallurgy instead of metallurgy, the querysmith, datamancer. So I write it attritionomy, which I cannot say. I always say attritionomy, just adding an extra, to that, attritionomy and metricurgy. So these are just these different elements and these different parts of the student life cycle to express data-driven artisanal student pieces, the interacting with Slate. And there was like before Slatewright, there was Slatesmith, the whole chopping down the tree thing. Instead of a lumberjack, it was a lumbar support jack. So I've had a lot of fun, and I fully understand this is a very navel-gazing episode to do. But it's on the Coffee and Coals, and that definitely is a place for these kinds of conversations for me to have as we kind of take a peek behind the curtain of my process, my journey. So all of these kind of really thematic elements I've really enjoyed. I writing the book, doing the podcast, doing all of that, wildly time consuming. And I think though, if I was not creating something that I wanted to read or listen to or enjoy, I don't know how I could possibly dedicate as much time to it as it requires. And then even like adding things like the Forge Bellows, which I kind of wanted a more kind of news. So for the folks who don't know, the Forge Bellows is my newsletter that I put out. It's an examination of the literature on adaptive enrollment management. Like I said, adaptive enrollment management is not this revolutionary concept to create better student experiences, but it takes so much of the work that everyone is doing and crystallizes it with a term that we can have conversations around. So it's not like, oh, we should do student personalization. It's like, let's implement adaptive enrollment management. Parts of that is, sure, strategic enrollment management, understanding what the institution needs, but part of that is also making sure we have a robust, whether it's your CRM system like Slate, data on the student, and also using all of those pieces to craft a really good artisanal student journey that helps them. And when I say artisanal, I just mean very student-centered, I should say. It's not that we need to send 85 emails a month or create this really flowery, opaque student experience. It's just we want to make sure that we are giving the student what they need when they need it and providing an opportunity for them to have an enjoyable experience. And I just kind of went up on my story. I'm like 8 threads down on what I was talking about. Yeah, even doing like the weird Slate Miss Christmas Carol video, the Slate anime team, the old 70s heist movie Slate team, the Failed by Design chopping the tree down anime allegory. All of these kind of elements. And it was funny, I was talking with John Rowan from Reworkflow after I had just done the Christmas Carol video. And I was like, if I knew how much time this was going to take, I never would have done that. And then literally 2 days later, I had the idea for the kind of the 90s anime team introduction, which ended up becoming the trading cards for like the Slate Captain, Tech Wiz, the coach, all of those pieces. That all started out as that idea that created another video, which was just as time consuming as the Christmas Carol one. or the tree anime, all these things. So it's just so funny because it is entirely too time consuming, but I do enjoy both the work of building it, but also like I enjoy the final product. And I totally understand if this is not everyone's cup of tea. There are definitely higher education podcasts that I listen to that I really strongly dislike the format of, but they have good guests and they talk about good topics, and I do still listen to them. And I'm sure that me leaning so hard into my theme probably is also that for somebody else. So hopefully I have compelling content that still has people listen to it, even if they're not as fond of the motif as I am. And there's so much conversation around when you do start something, whether it's a podcast or whatever it is, you niche down into something that you enjoy, that you can really lean into, get behind, that is just different. That's not going to necessarily sound like what everyone else in this space is doing. So I've niched down. There's 2,000 institutions that use Slate. So writing a book for at most an audience of 2,000, not the most economically prudent decision I've ever made in my life. But it is something I'm passionate about, and it's something that I'd like to think I'm relatively competent at. At least I tell myself that when the imposter syndrome is really kicking into overdrive, which, as it turns out, is constantly when you write a book and do a podcast and post so many times on LinkedIn. But I've learned so much about Slate and about the processes, just having to focus on the topics that I'm working on. And I think like the engagement scoring and the predictive modeling is such a great first step into adaptive enrollment management. Definitely, I don't want to be the predictive modeling guy. I also don't think that is an economically prudent pillar to base my entire career on, with AI coming as strongly as it is. But being able to have the conversations with the community, I've learned so much from the guests already. Like I said, Eric Hoffpower's quorum sensing really unlocked so much of the work that I'm currently doing. And that's just one random message he sent me. Extremely great guy, very kind. And I was like, oh, yeah, that is such a wonderful way to look at, again, that ecospherical contextual piece of a student. And the quorum scoring that I do is more so on the school basis, but incredibly helpful. So again, we're getting very far from the wordage and the vocabulary of the Innovation Forge. So I think it is prudent for me to probably end it here. Before I announce the winner of the naming convention, I want to properly introduce you to the Field of Stats Mouse. This is the tale of Professor Scope, Field of Stats Mouse. Before there were dashboards, before there were score bands, before the first applicant ever clicked submit, there were fields. Formless fields, vast, overgrown data fields full of unexplored patterns, underpowered models, and metrics no one knew quite how to measure. These fields stretched far and wide across the plains of enrollment, and in their tall, tangled grasses lived a curious creature named Professor Scope, a field mouse with a mind made for math. While her peers gathered breadcrumbs and acorns, Scope gathered insights. She climbed blades of unstructured data to spot hidden trends, and she could sniff out a false positive faster than you could say multivariate regression. The older mice called her peculiar, but Scope didn't mind. She had a mission. One evening, as the moon cast bar graphs across the grid paper skyscrapers, Scope stumbled upon an abandoned admissions report, drenched in coffee, streaked with red pen, but bursting with potential. Next to it, a mysterious badge glinted in the moonlight. It read, Empowering Admissions Workshop. From that day on, Scope trained herself in all things statistical, Z-scores, A-B testing, time series analysis, and even slate delivery. She taught herself to standardize, to segment, to forecast with flair. The local admissions crows began to whisper a tiny titan of Tableau. Some say she once built a yield model using only Excel, breadcrumbs, and an empty mechanical pencil. Eventually, the Slatewrights took notice. They offered her a lab coat, a clipboard, and an official title. Field of Stats Mouse. She was the predictive rodent, keeper of confidence intervals, guardian of model integrity. Now, Scope scurries through score bands and login streaks, interpreting behaviors and flagging anomalies faster than most humans can say percent to goal. If a model drifts or a dashboard spikes, she is already halfway through a rerun with cleaner parameters. And her motto? The smallest, most overlooked data point can be the key to the pattern beneath the noise. Now that we know Professor Scope, the field of Stats Mouse, let's talk about the person who named her. Kat Hart, Director of Admissions and Enrollment Communications at University of New Hampshire. Thank you so much for the wonderful name submission, Kat. I'll send you a message with a download link to the Innovation Forge. Or, if you are going to be one of the very, very lucky and very, very few who have already purchased the book, please let me know, and I'll get you something else. Maybe a version of you on the Season 1 trading cards, or Season 2. We have the Innovation Forge Codex. We can do one of those, or I even tentatively already have some Season 3 motifs planned for our visiting artisan designs. So just let me know, and I'll definitely get something out to you. But thank you so much for submitting the great name again. The last thing I want to do before we wrap up is introduce our next consultant, Cadre, for next month. We have this fun little guy. Again, please watch the video if you can. It's the Content Hawk. I really like how this is the first character that leans so much into the creative aspects of Slate and content blocks and the design elements that we can really leverage when we're working with Slate. So I'm just really excited to see how the names from the community comes up with this one. So please do send me those names to theinnovationforgepodcast at gmail.com, or just wait for the next interview to come out next month. Our visiting artisan episodes, I usually post that on like the Facebook group, and or connect with me on LinkedIn. That's also a great way to find me and send me a message for a character. You also get approximately 5 to 10 LinkedIn posts a week. So if you are in need of more Innovation Forge content, just send me a connect request or follow me on LinkedIn. And I, of course, will send a free ebook, as always, of the Innovation Forge to winning submitters. And I will all talk to you. Remember to strike true as we forge something extraordinary together.